Hyrum L. Andrus, all rights reserved. August 10 to 12, 1989. Lecture 2, Joseph Smith. I have always liked the words of Brigham Young, who said, quote, "I feel like shouting Alleluia all day long when I think that I ever knew Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet." Close quote. There is also the inspired and accurate statement of evaluation by John Taylor, which has been placed in the Doctrine and Covenants, in which he said, quote, "Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that ever lived in it." Close quote. The prophet Joseph stands as the head of the dispensation of the fullness of times, the dispensation into which all other dispensations must finally be gathered in order to make the fullness of times, or the fullness of dispensations, and in order to give the righteous of all ages a fullness of glory in the eternal world. When this is accomplished, then, as the Lord says in section 29, verse 30, the last shall be first. The prophet Joseph Smith will stand in proper status as he who has not only done most for the salvation of men on this earth, with the exception of Christ only, but he will stand next to Christ in the eternal world in relation to the Lord's work. The prophet Joseph Smith was seen and written about by many, many people. One of the most sophisticated observers was Josiah Quincy of the famous Quincy family. Josiah later became mayor of Boston. He and Charles Francis Adams visited the prophet Joseph Smith in May of 1844, just a little over a month prior to the martyrdom. Quincy later wrote a book called Figures of the Past, and the last chapter in it is called Joseph Smith at Nauvoo. He begins that chapter with these words, quote, "It is by no means improbable that some future textbook for the use of generations yet unborn will contain a question something like this: What historical American of the 19th century has exerted the most powerful influence upon the destinies of his countrymen?" And it is by no means impossible that the answer to that interrogatory may be thus written: Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. And the reply, as absurd as it doubtless seems to most men now living, may be an obvious commonplace to their descendants. History deals in such surprises and paradoxes, quite as startling as this. The man who established a religion in this age of free debate, who was and is today accepted by hundreds of thousands as direct emissary from the Most High, such a rare human being is not to be disposed of by pelting his memory with unsavory epithets. Fanatic, impostor, charlatan, he may have been, but these hard names furnish no solution to the problem he presents us. Fanatics and impostors are living and dying every day, and their memory is buried with them. But the wonderful influence which this founder of a religion exerted and still exerts throws him into relief before us, not as a rogue to be incriminated, but as a phenomenon to be explained." Close quote. Then he goes on and talks about the prophet. In the course of his article, he describes him, quote, "A fine-looking man is what the passerby would distinctively have murmured upon meeting this remarkable individual who has fashioned a mold which was to shape the feelings of so many thousands of his fellow mortals. But Joseph Smith was more than this. Close quote. And then he talks about great men with whom he has rubbed shoulders, those who exuded charisma, personality, character, all those things that make a human being great. He identifies a gentleman by the name of Elisha R. Potter of Rhode Island, and then he comments as follows. Of all men I've ever met, these two, Potter and the prophet Joseph Smith, seem best endowed with that kingly faculty which directs by intrinsic right the lives and the interests of other people. An old gentleman who joined the church in the early days of the church and later settled in Logan, Utah, was interviewed one day by a reporter who asked him if he knew Joseph Smith. He said, quote, "Did I know Joseph Smith? Well, I should think I did. I was one of his hired men for several years, and that simply means that I was a member of his family." Close quote. Well, what sort of man was he anyway? Asked the inquirer. The old veteran looked keenly at his inquirer and said, quote, "He was the biggest-hearted, bravest, most whole-souled man I ever knew. That's what he was. If ever I loved a man, it was Joseph Smith. Outside of all his priestly connections, he was an admirable man, a good man. I tell you, at least that's the way I regarded him. He was a lover of a good horse, and there wasn't any better horses around that country than old Charlie and Joe Duncan, the two animals he rode. And there wasn't any better horseman either about them parts than the prophet. Joe Duncan was a chestnut sorrel and was a beauty, but he wasn't anything as fine a horse as Charlie, a great big black fellow with a star on his forehead. Close quote. The prophet's enemies used to recognize him by his horse when he had Charlie, and many a time out on the farm, that star had to be painted out of his forehead in order to fool them. Joseph Smith had a good deal of affection for his horses, and we young fellows thought they were the greatest steeds on earth. The prophet was always kind and sympathetic in his way, but he wasn't afraid to rebuke anyone. And I never knew anyone who was more frank than he was. He called a spade, you bet. And he was just as brave and fearless as he was outspoken. He certainly was a man of all men. Close quote. Another early convert who spoke of the prophet was Patriarch Lorenzo Hatch. He gives us an interesting little insight into his nature and character. He said, quote, "I am rather proud and thankful that I knew Joseph Smith, for I don't have to take any other man's testimony as to what kind of man he was. I know that myself, and he was a fine man too, I can tell you. He was brave, fearless, and frank, but he was kind and sympathetic also. Some people imagine that he was an ignorant man, but that is entirely wrong, for in those days one seldom met a brighter, more progressive man than the prophet. Joseph Smith was a fine-looking man, tall, athletic, and built, quick, active, and about the finest figure on horseback that I've ever seen. I have never met a man yet that I admire so sincerely, and I've met a few too. You simply couldn't help but like him. He was so considerate, so sympathetic, and so manly." Close quote. Another good gentleman by the name of Jacob Earl spoke of the prophet Joseph Smith's commanding presence. This kingly faculty that Josiah Quincy mentions in his strength of mind and of body, and above all, that superiority of soul which was one of his distinguishing features. Lucy W. Campbell was an early convert, very intimate with the prophet. She gives this statement, quote, "What kind of person was Joseph Smith? Having been associated with him in life, I can answer that he was 6 feet in height, weighed about 200 pounds. His eyes were blue and tender, his hair a beautiful brown, soft and wavy. He was grandly proportioned, his carriage erect and graceful. He moved with an air of dignity peculiar to himself. He was 38.5 years old when martyred. Naturally, he was courteous, kind, and obliging, frank to all men, both friends and foe. He was remarkably cheerful for one who had seen well-tried friends martyred around him and felt the inflections of calumny, the vexations of lawsuits, the treachery of intimates and multiplied attempts upon his person in life, together with the cares of much business. Still, his influence among his friends was very great, and they were as ardently attached to him as his enemies were violently opposed to him. Free toleration was given to all opposing religions, and yet persecution followed him. Very many of the world looked upon the prophet as a marvel, confessed the mystery of his power and the accountability of his grandeur. The prophet lived a humble and upright life. The world knew him not. He sought only the salvation of the human family. When asked by strangers how it was that he held such power over the people, he replied that he taught them correct principles and they governed themselves. Peter Burnett was the first governor of the state of California. Prior to that, he lived in Missouri and was there at the time of the Missouri difficulties. Being of the legal profession, he acted as one of the prophet Joseph Smith's lawyers in the difficulties that were related to the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from the state of Missouri. Later, Burnett wrote about the prophet Joseph Smith and described him in his experiences with him. He said, quote, "Joseph Smith was a most extraordinary man. I was his lawyer in 1838 and 1839. I studied him as a man, not his religion. I knew him as a man. Joseph Smith was at least 6 foot tall and weighed 180 pounds or more." Close quote. I think Emma's good cooking got the best of his midriff when he got onto the naval period. He certainly was no ordinary man. He possessed the most indomitable perseverance and was a good judge of men. He deemed himself born to command, and he did command. His views were strange and striking, his manner earnest. One could not but be interested. There was a kind, familiar look about him, which pleased. He was courteous in discussion and would not oppose an opponent abruptly, but had due deference for the feeling of others. His views and illustrations were his own. He had great influence on others. When he talked about the prophet being taken prisoner there at Far West, and he was confined in a place that General Donovan called the bullpen, where they put the Mormon prisoners and treated them very harshly. But the prophet, with the majestic personality that he had, brings this statement from Peter Burnett. He says, quote, after a short period of 5 days, Joseph had managed to mollify his enemies to the extent that he could move about unprotected without danger. He was a strong athletic man and was known to have been a wrestler. The guards proposed that he wrestled one of their men. Smith courteously refused, on the ground that he was now a minister of the gospel. The men assured the prophet that there would be no betting or gambling. It would all be in fun. So the prophet then consented. They selected the best men among their number, and Joseph Smith threw him many times in succession, very much of the amusement of the spectators. Joseph Smith was an eloquent speaker and made a fine appearance. Sidney Rigdon did not possess the native intellect of Joseph, and he lacked Joseph's determination and will. Well, the prophet was a unique person. He was a man among men. A United States artillery officer spoke of him as follows, quote, Joseph is a noble-looking fellow, a Mohammed, every inch of him, who will not say that the Mormon prophet is not among the great spirits of the age, close quote. The New York Herald, in an article in Mormonism in the prophet's day, expressed it this way, quote, Joseph Smith, the president of the church, prophet, seer, and revelator, is 36 years of age, 6 feet high in pumps, weighing 212 pounds. He is a man of the highest order of talent and great independence of character, firm in his integrity and devoted to his religion. As a public speaker, he is bold, powerful, and convincing. As a leader, wise and prudent, yet fearless as a military commander. Brave and determined as a citizen, affable and kind, bland in his manners and of noble bearing. Probably Polly P. Pratt, who lived with him, traveled with him, and was one of the first members of the Quorum of the 12, gives us as accurate a pen picture of the prophet as we have. Elder Pratt writes as follows, quote, President Joseph Smith was in person tall and well-built, strong and athletic, of a light complexion, light hair, blue eyes, very little beard, and of an expression peculiar to himself, on which the eye naturally rested with interest and was never weary of beholding. His countenance was ever mine, affable, beaming with intelligence and benevolence, mingled with a look of interest and an unconscious smile of cheerfulness, and entirely free from all restraint of affectation of gravity. And there was something connected with the clear and steady, penetrating glance of his eyes, as if he would penetrate the deepest abyss of the human heart, and glaze into eternity, penetrate the heavens, and comprehend all worlds. He possessed a noble boldness and independence of character. His manner was easy and familiar, his rebuke terrible as the lion, his benevolence unbounded as the ocean, his intelligence universal, his language abounding in original eloquence peculiar to himself, not polished, not steadied, not smoothed and softened by education, and refined by art, but flowing forth in his own native simplicity, a profusely abounding in variety of subject and manner. He interested and edified, while at the same he amused and entertained his audience, and none listened to him who were ever weary with his discourse. I have even known him to retain a congregation of willing and anxious listeners for many hours together in the midst of cold and sunshine, rain or wind, while they were laughing at one moment and weeping the next. Even his most bitter enemies were generally overcome if he could once get their ears. In short, in him was the character of a Daniel and a Cyrus. These were wonderfully blended. The gifts, wisdom, and devotion of Daniel were united with the boldness, courage, temperance, perseverance, and generosity of his Cyrus. And had he been spared of martyr's fate until mature manhood and age, he was certainly endowed with powers and ability to revolutionize the world in many respects and to have transmitted the posterity and name associated with more brilliant and glorious act than has yet fallen to the lot of mortals. Now, that kind of observation comes not only from friends, but from foes. One person in meeting the prophet records this statement, quote, "My impression on beholding the prophet and shaking hands with him was that I stood face to face with the greatest man on earth." Close quote. Another, quote, "When I first saw him, I believed he was one of God's noble men, and as I grew older, I became thoroughly convinced that he was a true prophet of God." Close quote. Wilford Woodruff put it this way, quote, "In his public and private career, he carried with him the Spirit of the Almighty, and he manifested a greatness of soul which I have never seen in any other man." Close quote. Another person, quote, "I knew him as soon as I saw him. Although I was young, I knew that he was a man of God." Close quote. General Moses Wilson was one of the most bitter anti-Mormons, Mormon haters as they called them, in that day of Missouri, when the prophet was taken captive in Missouri. For a time, he was in the custody of Moses Wilson. Moses Wilson has this to say about him, quote, "He was a very remarkable man. I carried him into my house, a prisoner in chains, and in less than 2 hours my wife loved him better than she did me." Close quote. Well, that's the prophet, the kind of person who blends personality, charisma, and intellect with great, profound spiritual capabilities. All of these rolled into one magnificent bundle, if I can put it that way. Probably one of his most distinctive features was just the gaze of his eyes. We have accounts where that fact is brought out on more than one occasion. One person put it this way, quote, "His handsome blue eyes would seem to dive down to the inmost thoughts with their sharp, penetrating gaze. I felt when he was present that he could read me through and through." Close quote. He was very companionable, just the ideal kind of individual. In the fall of 1842, because his enemies were after him, the Missouri enemies and mob, etc., came over into Illinois, the prophet felt that it was appropriate to just retire from public life. So he went out into an area on the outskirts of Nauvoo, where the father of John Taylor lived. He would sleep in the Taylor home, have breakfast in the morning, and then he and John Taylor's younger brother, William Taylor, would knock around out of the brush and keep out of the way during the day. Then in the evening, they would come back to have the evening meal, sit around and talk about the things of the kingdom, and retire and repeat the performance the next day. William Taylor makes this report of that rather interesting and intimate association he had. Quote, "It is impossible for me to express my feelings in regard to this period of my life. I have never known the same joy and satisfaction in the companionship of any other person, man or woman, that I felt with him, the man who had conversed with the Almighty. He was always the most companionable and lovable of men, cheerful and jovial. Much has been said about his geniality and personal magnetism. I was a witness of this. People old and young loved him and trusted him instinctively. Close quote. Emmeline B. Wells, who later became famous as a Mormon writer and president of the Relief Society here in the Salt Lake area, was a convert in the Nauvoo period and became well acquainted with the prophet Joseph Smith. She makes this statement concerning him, quote, I heard him preach all of his last sermons, and frequently met him and shook hands with him, and always felt in my inmost soul that he was indeed a man unlike others. He possessed the innate refinement that one finds in a born poet. Close quote. He wasn't just a man of physical power, but he had sensitivity and refinement of character that one finds in a born poet or in the most highly cultivated intellectual and poetic nature. He was beyond my comprehension. The power of God rested upon him to such a degree that on many occasions he seemed transfigured. His expression was mild and almost childlike in repose. And when addressing the people who loved him, it seemed to adoration. The glory of his countenance was beyond description. At other times, the great power of his manner more than his voice, which was sublimely eloquent to me, seemed to shake the place on which we stood and penetrate the inmost heart of the hearers. And I am sure that then they would lay down their lives to defend him. I always listened spellbound to his every utterance, the chosen of God in this last dispensation. Close quote. The prophet was an active man, and he loved sports. As you read through the journals of the day and his own journal, you find repeated reference to his engaging in various physical kind of activity. He used to go out of his way to do it. He loved to wrestle, he loved to pull sticks, he loved to jump at the mark, he loved to play ball, and he loved the physical kinds of things. This apparently was characteristic of him, even as a young person. Prior to the time the prophet got the plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated, after the angel Moroni came and before he got the plates, that interim period between 1823 and 1827, he worked part-time, at least down in the southern part of the state of New York, for a gentleman by the name of Joseph Knight. Knight had quite a lot of land, hired young men to work for him. He had a couple of boys, one of them called Joseph Jr., and another was called Newell K. Knight. Joseph Jr. makes this comment speaking of the prophet, quote, his noble deportment, his faithful and his kind address could not fail to win the esteem of those who had the pleasure of his acquaintance. One thing I will mention, which seemed to be a peculiar characteristic with him in all of his boys' sports and amusements. I never knew anyone to gain advantage over him, and yet he was always kind and kept the goodwill of his playmates. Close quote. You find repeated reference to the prophet's physical activities. One person described him as, quote, being quick as a squirrel, strong as a lion, but as gentle as a lamb. Close quote. Major Joseph Mickey of Gallatin, Missouri, reported, quote, I saw Joseph Smith throw John Brassfield, the champion wrestler of the county. The first two falls out of a match of 3. He was a powerful man, close quote. Another acquaintance of the prophet put it this way, quote, I have seen the prophet wrestle and run and jump, but have never seen him beaten. In all that he did, he was manly and almost godlike. Close quote. On one occasion, the prophet was out taking up a collection for his good friend, Orrin Porter Rockwell. Rockwell was in the hands of the Missourians, and the Missouri law in those days wasn't worth very much, particularly with the hatred of the Missourians against the Latter-day Saints. They had sent word that if the prophet would raise a certain amount of money, they would free Porter, who was one of the prophet's close and bosom friends, and allow him to come home. So the prophet was out taking up a collection. As he wandered around or went around the street, he found on a vacant lot there in Nauvoo a group of young Mormon boys engaging in the frontier activities and sports of the time, pulling sticks and wrestling. Among them was a big fellow from the neighborhood town of La Harpe, Illinois. He had pretty well showed his mastery over all the Mormon boys in the area. As the prophet came up to make his wishes known, this big fellow figured he'd put the final feather in his cap, so he challenged Joseph Smith to a wrestle. The prophet took up the collection and said, okay. So they squared off. This fellow made a pass at him, which was his last. The prophet stepped nimbly to the side, grabbed him by the nape of the neck and the seat of the breeches, and hoisted him bodily over the top of his head, walked a short distance, and dropped him into a ditch of water right on his back. And when the fellow came up, bubbling and spouting, the prophet reached out his hand with a big, broad grin on his face, pulled him out, slapped him on the back, and said, quote, now you mustn't mind this. When I'm with the boys, I like to make all the fun for them I can. Close quote. That's the kind of person that he was. He loved social things. As Benjamin F. Johnson, who became a close and intimate friend to him, said, quote, when with us, there was no lack of amusement, for with jokes, games, etc., he was always ready to provoke merriment, one phase of which was watching couplets and rhyme. Close quote. The prophet was a man of extreme integrity. He just had a quality of integrity that you seldom see in a person. This kind of thing, this quality within him, brought him to the point where, in his feelings and thinking, he simply did everything that a human being ought to do. He treated other people completely and fully as he would want them to treat him. He did his share of work around so that it wasn't a matter of saying, quote, well, I'm the prophet of the Lord, and I have to go talk to the Lord, and you guys do the work. Close quote. For example, as they were traveling in Zion's camp, that body of a couple hundred men left Kirtland and marched for 1,000 miles or so down to Jackson County to make an effort to reinstate the Latter-day Saints on their lands, since they had been driven out of Jackson County by the mob. As they were going along in a frontier situation with few, if any, roads, in the spring of the year, and with mud sometimes axle deep, this situation reduced people down to basic integrity. We have this statement made of the prophet, quote, Zion's camp in passing through the state of Indiana, had to cross very bad swamps. Consequently, we have to attach ropes to the wagons to help them through. The prophet was the first man at the rope in his bare feet. This was characteristic of him." Close quote. The prophet had a childlike simplicity, and he loved children. When a group of Latter-day Saints would come into Kirtland, converts from some area, the prophet would go to meet them. After shaking hands with the men and saying howdy to the ladies, he'd go play with the kids. He was just that kind of person. One reporter made this statement of him, quote, "Joseph was noted for his childlike love and familiarity with children, and he never seemed to feel that he was losing any of his honor or dignity in doing so. If he heard a child cry, he would rush out of the house to see if it was harmed." Close quote. Another statement, quote, "He was a great favorite among the children. I have known him many times to stop as he passed the playgrounds when he were out of school and shake hands with the girls and play ball and marbles with the boys." Close quote. Another statement, quote, "One marked illustration of his character was his love for children. He never saw a child but what he desired to take it up and bless it. In many he did so bless, taking them in his arms and upon his knee. I have myself sat upon his knee. He was so fond of children that he would go far out of his way to speak to a little one, which is to me a striking characteristic of true manhood. He had a like true love for the human race." Close quote. Then here finally was the disposition of the prophet Joseph when he saw little children in the mud. He would take them up in his arms and wash the mud from their bare feet with his handkerchief. Oh, how kind he was to the old folks as well as to the little children. He always has a smile for his friends and was always cheerful. That's the kind of person he was in the sense of basic endowments. Let's shift gear and talk about another aspect of the prophet's life. He was raised on frontier or semi-frontier conditions. When his mother, Lucy Mack, brought the family, Joseph Smith Sr. having preceded them to Palmyra, she had about 2 cents left after making the journey from New England down to New York. They homesteaded some land there, just thickly covered with trees. You know that you don't grow very much wheat when you have trees so thick you can hardly see the sunshine. So they exerted every effort, first of all to clear the land, and then to work on the side to just get the basic necessities of life. As a result of this kind of life in his early days, the prophet had very, very little opportunities, if any, to get an education. Martin Harris said that when he began to translate the Book of Mormon, he couldn't spell the word February without using the Hyrum and Thummim. M.S. Smith said that he couldn't dictate a coherent letter, and yet she said over and over again she saw him as he dictated a period of 75 working days, or thereabouts, this sacred volume we call the Book of Mormon. As she would call dinner, the scribe would cease, and they might just stop right in the middle of a sentence. And when the prophet came back and picked up the Hyrum and Thummim, he didn't say, quote, "Oliver, read back the last paragraph to see where we were going." Close quote. He just took the Hyrum and Thummim, looked in it, dictate the next word, and rolled right on through, just like there had been no break. I've written several books, and you just can't do that kind of thing. It just can't be done, unless you want to have some kind of wandering Mandarin document. You can't do that and get the kind of document you have in the Book of Mormon. George A. Smith, the prophet's cousin, called him a plowboy, one who cultivated the earth and had scarcely education enough to read his Bible. Orson Pratt, who was an early convert when he was in from his mission, at times stayed with the prophet in his home. He explained the basic educational capabilities of the prophet in these words. Quote, he could read without much difficulty and write a very imperfect hand and had a very limited understanding of the elementary rules of arithmetic. These were his highest and only attainments. Close quote. When the prophet began the translation of the Book of Mormon, it was under these circumstances. That doesn't mean that he stayed that way. The prophet got up early in the morning, day after day, week after week, and he studied grammar, and he studied German, and he studied Hebrew. He became a very learned and polished individual. He was a person who had a native intellect that I simply personally don't believe we've seen equaled in the church since his day. I was talking one time in the historian's office with Preston Nibley, who has written 20 or 30 books on Mormon subjects, including a biography of the prophet. He was saying, quote, you know, when I wrote my book on Brigham Young, and he wrote a husky one of President Young, I got so familiar with him that I could start reading the report of his sermon, and I could tell you how he was going to end it. But I never could do that with Joseph Smith. Close quote. Then he observed, quote, in my personal feeling, I think Brigham Young was our second greatest president. But to me, I don't think he came up to the top of the prophet's shoes. What do you think, Brother Andrus? Close quote. I said, quote, well, I hate to disagree with you, Brother Nibley. Close quote. That kind of took him back. He said, quote, well, what do you think? Close quote. I said, quote, I don't think he came up to the top of the prophet's souls. Close quote. Now, maybe he was more accurate than I was, but the prophet had a tremendous native intellect, and he had an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Now, maybe some of you sophisticated folks won't know exactly what these similes mean when he said of Joseph, quote, he was the calf that sucked 3 cows, close quote. He just couldn't get enough. He was that kind of person. When he began the translation of the Book of Mormon, he did it under extremely humble circumstances. He began with a friend and neighbor not too far distant from where they lived. But the name of Martin Harris, who in that day was a well-to-do farmer, the Lord instructed the prophet to invite Martin to come over and help him translate the Book of Mormon. The prophet sent word over to Martin, quote, come over to our place this evening and let's talk about it, close quote. So Martin made his way on over to the Smith home. They talked about the thing. Joseph told him the story, and Martin didn't know whether he wanted to believe it or not. At that time, the prophet had the plates in his possession, but as you know, he wasn't permitted to allow anyone to see the contents or to see the record itself. But he had them in an old Ontario glass box. He allowed Martin Harris to pick up the glass box and to shake it, to rattle it. He could hear the metallic plates in their rattling. After the visit, Martin went on his way home, pondering what he had been told and what he had experienced. In his mind, this is the way he evaluated it. He said, quote, I knew that the Smith family didn't have enough money to buy that much gold, and I knew that the contents either had to be gold or lead. I knew also that they didn't have enough money to buy that much lead, so I had to conclude that the prophet had found gold plates because there was something metallic in there that weighed heavy enough to be gold or lead, and they just didn't have enough money to buy that much lead. Close quote. When the prophet went with Martin down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where they began to translate, and then Martin lost the first unit of the abridgment of Mormon, called the Book of Lehi, the 116 pages. Oliver Cowdery then came to work with him in the spring of 1829. By that time, the prophet was basically destitute of any sustenance. He had made friends with the Knight family, as I indicated. He worked for Joseph Knight. Apparently, Joseph Knight knew that he was over there working on the Book of Mormon. So one day, he took his wagon and loaded it full of provisions and headed out to Harmony. When he got there, he couldn't find the prophet. The prophet and Oliver were out trying to find work because they were just that desperate. He finally found them and supplied their physical needs. Then he found that they didn't have any paper on which to write the translation, and they didn't have any money to buy any paper. So Joseph Knight goes into town and buys a whole bunch of foolscap paper. He indicates that under those circumstances, the prophet begins the translation. The prophet's father-in-law lived just across the street from where Joseph and Emma lived. Isaac Hell was a great hunter and a great trapper, and he had in the backyard an old hide house. It was an old shack that he had rigged up with means to hang the hides on. When he skinned a skunk, he hung it up out there, or a muskrat, or a beaver, or something like this. He hung it up there. The prophet began the translation of the Book of Mormon out there in Isaac Hell's old hide house, writing the manuscript on paper that Joseph Knight provided, and living on the food that Joseph Knight provided, and not able to spell the word of February without using the Hyrum and Thummim. Those were the circumstances out of which the gospel came in this day. And yet the prophet was one with a tremendous native ability, with a tremendous intellect, a tremendous capacity of mind, and with a kind of faith where he could stand on earth in mortality and his head be above the veil, where he could penetrate the heavens, and where he received ministrations from angelic beings far more than we realize. Under those circumstances, then, this great work came forth. For this reason, some of his later associates talk about the contrast in his life. John Taylor, for example, put it this way, quote, I can tell you what he told me. He said that he was very ignorant of the ways, designs, and purposes of God, and knew nothing about them. He was a youth at the time of his vision, unacquainted with religious matters or systems or theories of the day. He was ignorant of letters as the world has it, but the most profoundly learned and intelligent man in afterlife that I have ever met in my life. And I have traveled hundreds of thousands of miles, been on different continents, and mingled with all classes and creeds of people, yet I have never met a man so intelligent as Joseph Smith." Close quote. In my opinion, President Brigham Young was the Prophet Joseph Smith's most ardent and devoted disciple. President Young spoke of contemporary sectarians as being as blind as Egyptian darkness without correct information about heaven, hell, God, angels, or devils. But when I saw Joseph Smith, he took heaven, figuratively speaking, and brought it down to earth. And he took the earth and brought it up and opened up in plainness and simplicity the things of God, and that is the beauty of his mission." Close quote. Then another occasion, he expressed it this way, quote, "In my experience, I never did let an opportunity pass of getting with the Prophet Joseph and of hearing him speak in public or in private, so that I might draw understanding from the foundation from which he spoke. In the days of Prophet Joseph, such moments were more precious to me than all the wealth of the world. No matter how great my poverty, if I had to borrow a meal to feed my wife and children, I never let an opportunity pass of learning what the prophet had to impart." Then he confesses, quote, "This now is the secret of your humble servant Brigham." Close quote. This is where he got his insight and his understanding. When then did the prophet get his? How was he taught? I have 4 college degrees, including a PhD, and I'd trade all of mine without even blinking an eye for just 1/2 of what Joseph Smith had and what he got in the way of education. It began with that great theophany we call the first vision. In the spring of 1820, when he came out of the sacred grove, he knew more about God and about the nature of God than the whole Christian world combined. The real education that was given to the prophet began with the angel Moroni. This was kind of an ideal kind of education, where you've got 2 people sitting on the log and eyeball-to-eyeball instruction between them. He began to pray to the Lord to determine what his condition and situation was before God. He says, quote, "In this situation, hours passed unnumbered. How many or how few, I know not. Neither is he able to inform me, but I suppose that it must have been 11 or 12, and perhaps later, as the noise and bustle of the family in retiring had long since ceased." While continuing in prayer for a manifestation that in some way his sins were forgiven, endeavoring to exercise faith in the Scriptures, on a sudden a light like that of a day, only of a purer and far more glorious appearance and brightness, burst into the room. Indeed, to use his own description, the first sight was as though the house was filled with consuming and unquenchable fire. This sudden appearance of a light so bright as must naturally be expected would be a shock or sensation visible to the extremities of the body. It was, however, followed with a calmness and a serenity of mind in an overwhelming rapture of joy that surpassed understanding, and in a moment a personage stood before him, notwithstanding the room was previously filled with light above the brightness of the sun, as I had before described. Yet there seemed to be an additional glory surrounding or accompanying this personage, which shone with increased degree of brilliancy, of which he was in the midst. And though this countenance was as lightning, yet it was of a pleasing, innocent, and glorious appearance, so much so that every fear was banished from the heart, and nothing but calmness pervaded the soul." Moroni began to quote biblical prophecies, and the official statement that we have in the Pearl of Great Price. You have some of the scripture references identified by the prophet, which Moroni quoted, but if you'll go to Oliver Cowdery's account, he gives you literally many times more. He begins this description by saying, quote, "Now, I might not get the words exactly that the angel repeated, but I'll give you the substance in the scriptural references." Then he goes on, page after page after page, and when he gets through, he says, quote, "Again, I may not have followed the exact words, but I have given you a true account of the substance." Close quote. So Moroni spent considerable time explaining biblical scriptures to the prophet, but this isn't all. In addition to this, Moroni used divine means of instruction. You remember when the prophet reported that Moroni had told him about the golden plates on the hill Cumorah. He says as he was speaking concerning this repository, there on yonder hill, he says, "The vision was open so that I could see, and this so clearly that when I went there the next day, I had no difficulty finding the place." It's this visual kind of instruction. For example, Oliver Cowdery gives us this statement of the way by which Joseph Smith was taught. Quote, "When God manifests to his servant those things that are to come, or those which have been, he does it by unfolding them by the power of that Spirit which comprehends all things always. And so much may be shown and made perfectly plain to the understanding in a short time, that the world who are occupied all their life to learn a little, look at the relation of it and are disposed to call it false." Close quote. Now note, he says, quote, "You will understand by this that while those glorious things were being rehearsed, the vision was also open so that our brother was permitted to see and understand much more fully and perfectly than I am able to communicate to you in writing." Close quote. For example, Moroni told him about the ancient inhabitant on this continent, but he didn't just tell him, he showed them to him. In the Wentworth letter, from which we get the Articles of Faith, the prophet wrote as follows, quote, "I was informed concerning the aboriginal inhabitants of this country, and show who they were and from whence they came. A brief sketch of their origin, progress, civilization, laws, governments, of their righteousness and iniquity, and the blessings of God being withdrawn from them as a people was made known unto me." He had the Book of Mormon down cold before he got the plates out of the hill. He had seen the Lehi colony. He had seen their coming into this land. He had seen the whole history clear down to the winding up thing. And all of this through visual means there in September 1823. Imagine having that kind of understanding what the Smith family home evening would be like after that. Mother Smith tells us a little about it, and they did have them. She says, quote, during our evening conversation, and she's talking about 1823 and 1824, in that period of time. Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that you could imagine. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, and the animals on which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life among them. Close quote. In another statement, Mother Smith says, quote, during the day our sons would endeavor to get through their work as early as possible and say, Mother, have supper early so we can have a long evening to listen to Joseph. Sometimes Joseph would describe the appearance of the Nephites, their mode of dress and warfare, their implements of husbandry, and many things he had seen in vision. Oliver Cowdery gives us two examples scripturally of the way by which Joseph Smith was taught. One of them is here in the Book of Ether. You know, Mark Twain said he once read the Book of Mormon and he called it chloroform in print. He must have started here in the Book of Ether, in my opinion. But here in the Book of Ether, you do have seriously now the account of the brother of Jared, and the great vision that was shown to him, here in Ether 3, and this is a reference that Oliver Cowdery gives as an example of how Joseph Smith was taught. Verse 25, quote, when the Lord had said these words, he showed unto the brother of Jared all the inhabitants of the earth which had been, and also all that would be, and he withheld them not from his sight, even unto the ends of the earth. Close quote. In a similar way, Joseph Smith was taught. Oliver Cowdery gives another reference, and this is over in the Book of Moses, in the Pearl of Great Price, chapter 1, where when Moses was talking with the Lord, the record says that he cast his eyes and beheld the earth, yea, even all of it, and there was not a particle of it which he did not behold, discerning it by the Spirit of God. And he beheld also the inhabitants thereof, and there was not a soul which he beheld not, and he discerned them by the Spirit of God, and their numbers were great, even numberless as the sands of the sea. Close quote. Moroni used the same divine means to teach Joseph Smith. He showed him the Lehi colony. He unfolded the scriptures and taught them to him not merely by verbal means, but by the intelligent powers of the Spirit and by visual means and processes, so that when the prophet comes out of that experience, he has an education based on what I would call celestial audiovisual techniques. As the prophet went to the hill Cumorah the next day, he was taught further things, this time the vision opening in two different ways. One, he sees into the spirit world and he sees the forces of the adversary. As he went to the hill Cumorah, he had dollar signs in his eyes. I mean, he was tempted because of the monetary value of those records. If you haven't got any money to buy a pound of lead, you might think twice if the angel tells you there is gold in those hills. So as he went to the hill Cumorah, he was caught up with the fact that these plates were made of gold, and he had dollar signs in his eyes. When he got up on the hill Cumorah, he immediately found the place, got himself a stick, and pried off the top stones of the sacred repository, and began to reach down to lift out the plates. As he did, a very severe and powerful shock came on his body, and he just couldn't reach his hands any further. It threw him back, and he looked at the thing, and there they were, and he made another effort at it. He was a husky fellow, so he tried it again, and this time another powerful shock. So he made a third effort. This time he ended up on his back down the hill a ways. He made the comment, quote, "Why can't I get this thing? What's the matter?" Close quote. The messenger said, quote, "Because you haven't kept the commandments." Close quote. And he explained to him that strict requirements were necessary, and that as a result of not keeping those strict requirements, he was not permitted to take the plates at the time. With this, and here's how Oliver Cowdery explains it, quote, "In that instant he looked to the Lord in prayer. As he prayed, darkness began to disperse from his mind, and his soul was lit up as in the evening before. He was filled with the Holy Ghost. Again did the Lord manifest his condescension and mercy. The heavens were open, and the glory of the Lord shone round about and rested upon him. While thus he stood, gazing and admiring, the angel said, quote, 'Look,' and as he thus spake, he beheld the prince of darkness surrounded by his innumerable train of associates." Close quote. All this passed before him, and the heavenly messenger said, quote, "All this is shown, the good and the evil, the holy and the impure, the glory of God and the power of darkness, that you may know the difference and know how to differentiate hereafter between the two powers, and never be influenced or overcome by the wicked one. Behold, whatsoever entices or leads to do good is of God, and whatsoever does not comes from the wicked one. It is he that fills the hearts of men with evil, to walk in darkness and to blaspheme God. And you may learn from henceforth that his ways are to destruction, but the way of holiness is peace and rest." Close quote. Then the prophet was given a vision of the future, including the restoration of the gospel, the restoration of the holy priesthood, and things that go on down, even future to our day, and that we haven't yet seen fulfilled. As the prophet saw this vision of the powers of darkness and the glory of God, he was told concerning this ancient record. He says, quote, "On it is contained the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as it was given to the Lord's people on this land. And when it shall be brought forth by the power of God, it shall be carried to the Gentiles, of whom many will receive it. And after will the seed of Israel be brought into the fold." Close quote. Then he goes on and explains that when this comes forth, quote, "Persecution will increase, and those that are not built upon the rock will seek to overthrow you and will seek your life. When they are interpreted, the Lord will give the holy priesthood to some, and they will begin to proclaim this gospel and baptize by water. And after they shall have power to give the Holy Ghost by the laying on of their hands, then will persecution rage more and more. For the iniquities of men shall be revealed, and those who are not built upon the rock will seek the overthrow of this church. But it will increase the more and more opposed, and spread farther and farther, increasing in knowledge till they shall be sanctified. Close quote. And note this, quote, and receive an inheritance where the glory of God shall rest upon them. Close quote. Now we're talking about getting back to Jackson County, building Zion where the spiritual endowment will be given, because we finally build Zion and do the things that we should. The spiritual endowment will be such that the Lord will create upon every dwelling place in Mount Zion, and upon all of her assemblies, a cloud and smoke by day, and the flaming fire by night. That kind of spiritual endowment. So he says, this work will continue until finally the saints will receive an inheritance where the glory of the Lord shall rest upon them. When this takes place, when you get to that point, and all these things are prepared, the 10 tribes of Israel will be revealed in the north country. Close quote. When do the 10 tribes come in? Some people think we're already gathering them. Well, we're gathering Israel. That's true, because Israel is not only in a body, but they are also dispersed throughout the world. But there is a body, and to that group of people Jesus went and ministered after visiting the Nephites. They are to return, and he indicates their return is after the saints have been sanctified and received an inheritance where the glory of the Lord rests upon them. He goes on to say, quote, and then this is fulfilled, close quote. Or when the 10 tribes come, quote, then will he brought to pass that saying of the prophet, close quote. And he quotes Isaiah chapter 59 verse 20, quote, and the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and to them that return from transgression in Jacob, saith the Lord, close quote. A lot of us are looking for the second coming. We talk about it once in a while, and we usually have reference to that great world appearance where Christ comes in glory in the clouds of heaven, and every eye sees him, and the wicked are consumed, and the righteous are caught up to meet him, and his kingdom is made universal. But what we sometimes fail to understand is that Christ will appear among the righteous of his people and live among them for a matter of years before he comes into the world in glory. And this will take place, this appearance of Christ, as Moroni explained it, will take place after 2 prior events. Number 1, after the saints have finally lived the gospel to the point that they receive an inheritance where the glory of the Lord rests upon them. And then after the 10 tribes come from the north countries. Then, after those 2 things, the words of Isaiah will be fulfilled, who writes that the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and to those who turn from ungodliness in Jacob. See, for example, the explanations of Jesus to the Nephites in 3 Nephi 20, verse 22, and 21, verse 25. As the prophet is instructed concerning these things, then he is shown that this work to come forth is designed to bring about marvelous transformations, not only in individual lives, and not only on this land, but ultimately throughout the world. The prophet Joseph put it this way, quote, I intend to lay a foundation that will revolutionize the world. It will not be by sword or gun that this will be accomplished, but the power of truth is such that it will ultimately be done." Close quote. But as Moroni discussed with the prophet these events, he says this, quote, "Therefore, says the Lord, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. The wisdom of their wise shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent shall be hid. For according to his covenants which he made with his ancient saints, his people, the house of Israel, must come to a knowledge of the gospel, and win that Messiah whom their fathers rejected, and with them the fullness of the gospel, be gathered then to rejoice in one fold and one shepherd." Quote, "Now this cannot be brought to pass. This marvelous work and a wonder cannot be brought to pass until first certain preparatory things are accomplished. For so has the Lord proposed in his own mind. He has therefore chosen you as an instrument, speaking to Joseph, as an instrument in his hand, to bring to light that which shall perform his strange act, and bring to pass a marvelous work and a wonder." Close quote. Now, the Book of Mormon to me is the greatest miracle of modern times. To think that the prophet whipped that off in 75 working days, and to really get into it and understand what it says, it contains the key not only to the knowledge of the gospel, but of our day, that is superior to anything you can find anywhere else, and it is prophetic to the nth degree. If you want to know more about what's going to happen in the 1990s, the best source to go to is the Book of Mormon. If you read it and read it in the way it is intended, that you understand it. Sometimes we call the Book of Mormon the marvelous work and a wonder, but that's not so. The Book of Mormon was a preparatory action to the marvelous work. The marvelous work and a wonder is the establishment of the Lord's kingdom, the gathering of Israel, the whole new order of society and of government that will bring peace and righteousness and renovate the earth and renew the earth to a paradisiacal state of glory. That's the marvelous work and a wonder. In that marvelous work, the wisdom of the wise will perish, and the understanding of the prudent will be hid. It's that kind of work that the Lord initiated through this young man, the prophet Joseph Smith. In connection with that, it wasn't just a matter of Moroni appearing on the scene. Besides Moroni, on those early days, there were other Nephite prophets. For example, in the Whitworth letter, and I'm talking about 1823 to 1827, that period of time, the prophet Joseph writes as follows, quote, "After having received many visits from the angels of God," and the word is plural, angels, not just Moroni, unfolded the majesty and glory of the events that should transpire in the last days, on the morning of September 1827, the angel of the Lord delivered the record into my hand. Close quote. Now he had angels, many angels prior to getting the plates. We usually say Moroni, John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John. But you see what we've left out with that kind of statement. Here's John Taylor, quote, "When Joseph Smith was raised up as a prophet of God, Mormon Moroni, Nephi, and others of the ancient prophets who formerly lived on this continent, and Peter and John and others who lived on the Asiatic continent came to him. Close quote. Here's George Q. Cannon, who was one of the great minds of the church and a counselor in the first presidency for more than one prophet, says, quote, "If you will read the history of the church from the beginning, you will find that Joseph was visited by various angelic beings, but not one of them professed to give him the keys until John the Baptist came to him. Moroni, who held the keys to the stick of Ephraim, visited Joseph. He doubtless also had visits from Nephi, and it may have been from Alma and others. But though they came and had authority, holding the authority of the priesthood, we have no account of their ordaining him." Close quote. See, what I'm trying to say is that the prophet had familiarity with the ancient personalities of the past. William Taylor, who was with him in those days when he was keeping out of the sight of the Missourians who were after him, has this to say about him as he evaluates Joseph. He says, quote, "He seemed to be just as familiar with the spirit world and as well acquainted with the other side as he was here." Close quote. If you read section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenant, about verse 20 and 21, you'll find that the prophet delineates many of the major events in the ushering of this dispensation. He begins with the coming of Moroni and then talks about other events that happened. Michael, who was Adam, appeared on the banks of the Susquehanna River. He talks about Peter, James, and John. Then, in verse 21, he says this, quote, "And again the voice of God in the chamber of old Father Whitmer in Fayette, Seneca County, and at sundry times, and in divers places through all the travels and tribulation of this Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the voice of Michael, the archangel, the voice of Gabriel, who was Noah, and Raphael, and of diverse angels from Michael or Adam down to the present time, all declaring their dispensation, their rights, their keys, their honors, their majesty and glory, and the power of their priesthood." Close quote. As President John Taylor spoke of it, he says this, quote, "Although the church was so few in numbers, the principles and purposes of God were developed fully to the vision of Joseph Smith's mind, and he gazed upon the things that are to transpire in the last days, associated with the dispensation that he was called upon by the Almighty to introduce. He learned by communication from the heavens, from time to time, of the great events that should transpire in the latter day. He understood things that were past and comprehended the various dispensations and the designs of those dispensations. He not only had the principles developed, but he was conversant that the parties who officiated as the leading men of those dispensations, and from a number of them he received authority and keys and priesthood and power for the carrying out of the great purposes of the Lord in the last days." Close quote. John Taylor lists the following with whom the prophet was intimately acquainted: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, Adam, Seth, Enoch, Jesus, the Father, the Nephite apostles, and the Asiatic apostles. If you wanted the prophet to describe Adam, he would do so, and he did at times. Some people get the idea that Adam was some kind of half baboon or half monkey or some kind of personality, but Adam had a perfect physique with power physically enough to live almost 8,000 years. And that's more than any of us here have. I mean, he could outrun anyone here when he was 600 years old. When the prophet talks about him, he says after the fall, when he went out hunting, he didn't worry about using a weapon. He just ran them down. On another occasion, he talks about Adam and says he was a very handsome man, a man of great strength. On one occasion, a good sister up in New York had been converted to the gospel, and while she was doing her work about the house, a glorious vision opened to her, and she saw a personage, a very glorious personage. She describes him, but she felt that maybe, for the sake of not being deceived, she shouldn't tell anyone. So she told her husband, and that was about as far as it went. One day, the prophet Joseph happened to be passing through on his way back east, and he stopped over and stayed overnight with them. As they conversed in the evening, this good sister took the opportunity to relate her vision to him and said, quote, "Now, brother Joseph, I don't want to be deceived. What do you think about it?" Close quote. The prophet informed her that she had a true vision and it was from the Lord, and that the person she saw was Adam. He said he had seen the same angel several times. It was Michael, the archangel, who was revealed to her. He had seen him several times. It's that kind of person. We think of Peter, James, and John coming to restore the priesthood back in the wilderness between Harmony and Colesville, but they were on the scene more often than that. In Missouri, the prophet commented to the brethren one time, quote, "I was talking to the Apostle Peter the other day, and this is what he told me." Close quote. And as you hear men like Heber C. Kimball speak, they tell you that Peter and John were in the temple for at least an hour and a half on one occasion, the Kirtland Temple. The prophet sits down and has an hour and a half conversation with John the Revelator. It's that kind of experience that you've got to see if you want to understand Joseph Smith. He lived and breathed this kind of thing to such an extent that, as William Taylor says, he was as familiar over there as he was here. You have kind of a hard time distinguishing where the veil fits in between when you have a person like that. And under those circumstances, he was taught and instructed, and this not only by ministry but by visual means. And it's on this basis that much that we have that we call the gospel is given. We talk about the 3 degrees of glory revelation. If you read section 76, the prophet tells you that he and Sidney Rigdon were working on the inspired revision of the Bible. As they came to a certain passage in the 5th chapter of John, it was given to them differently than as it is recorded in the King James Version. As it was given to them, they marveled, and as they marveled, the glory of the Lord rested upon them. Then the vision was opened, and they saw the future destiny of the human family. There were about a dozen people in the room at the time. or at least before the whole thing was over with. One of these men was a good brother by the name of Fellow Dibble. He gives us this account. Quote, Joseph would at intervals say, "What do I see?" as one might say while looking out of the window and beholding that which all in the room could not see. Then he would relate what he had seen or what he was looking at. Then Sidney would reply, "I can see the same thing," and would repeat what they had seen or was seeing. Joseph would reply, "I can see the same thing." This manner of conversation, Brother Neville says, was repeated at short intervals to the end of the vision, and during the whole time, not a word was spoken by any other person. Not a sound or motion was made by any but Joseph and Sidney. It seemed to me that they never moved a joint or a limb during the time I was there, which was over an hour to the end of the vision. Close quote. He came a little bit late. Quote, Joseph sat firmly and calmly all the time in the midst of a magnificent glory, but Sidney sat limp and pale, apparently as limber as dish rag, observing which, Joseph smiling said, "Brother Sidney isn't used to this like I am." Close quote. It's under those kinds of circumstances that we not only get the 3 degrees of glory vision, and what we have in section 76 is only a small fraction of what Joseph Smith received. Here in the teaching, Joseph makes this observation, quote, "I could explain 100 times more than I ever have of the glories of the kingdom manifested to me in the vision, where I permitted and were the people prepared to receive it." Close quote. See, I could give you 100 times more than what's in section 76. It's this kind of thing that we need to see in order to appreciate Joseph Smith. There is one account of the prophet where he says something like this, quote, "After I got through translating the Book of Mormon, I took the Hyrum and Thummim and read the Bible." Close quote. Now let me just stop here for a minute. The Hyrum and Thummim operates on a visual principle. When Abraham had the Hyrum and Thummim, if you read Abraham 3, he says, quote, "Now I, Abraham, had the Hyrum and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given me at Ur of the Chaldees. And I saw the stars that they were great, and that there was one of them nearest the throne of God. And there were many great ones which were near unto it." Close quote. Then he records this great vision of the stellar heavens to which we belong, with Kolob as the great governing orb of this galaxy. The Hyrum and Thummim operates on a visual principle. One of the things that Moroni taught the prophet when he was sitting on the hill with him during those 4 years was how to use the Hyrum and Thummim. When he finally got the plates, he was far more interested with the Hyrum and Thummim than he was with the plates themselves. He went there initially, as I have said, with $signs on his eyes. But when he finally got there, he was far more interested in the Hyrum and Thummim than the plates, because, he said, quote, "I can look in this thing and see anything that I want to see." Close quote. When the prophet completed the translation of the Book of Mormon, he says, quote, "I took the Hyrum and Thummim and read the Bible. I read the book of Genesis, and I saw the things that were recorded therein." Close quote. You think for a minute what that includes? That's the creation, the garden, the fall, the antediluvian period, the flood, clear on down through to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. Then he says, quote, I read the book of Exodus and I saw the things that are recorded there. Close quote. That's the great Exodus of Israel. That's better, I'm sure, than what Cecil B. DeMille did. Then he says, quote, I so continued from one book to another until I have read the whole of it. The whole Bible passed before me like a great panorama. Close quote. Then he kind of mused about the sectarian ministers who were bombarding him. Quote, Old ignoramus Joe Smith, close quote, etc. And he said, quote, Why, I've forgotten 1,000 times more about the Bible than they ever knew, close quote. When the prophet translated the Book of Mormon, he translated not just as a bright intellect, he translated as a seer. He translated by a visual means. For example, here in the 8th chapter of the Book of Mosiah, we have an account where the Nephite wanted to know about the Jaredite records. Ammon had a little insight to help the Nephite king. Verse 13, quote, Ammon said unto him, I can assuredly tell thee, O king, of a man that can translate the records, for he has wherewith that he can look and translate all record that are of ancient date. Close quote. It's a visual process. He was wherewith he can look, and it is a gift from God. And the things are called interpreters, and no man can look in them except he be commanded, lest he should look to that he ought not, and he should perish. And whatsoever is commanded to look in them, the same is called seer. Close quote. The root word being see. When Joseph Smith translated, he did so as a seer. Here in section 3, the Lord is making reference to the lost book of Nephi, the 116-page manuscript that Martin Harris lost. He makes this statement in verse 12, quote, And when thou deliverest up that which God had given thee sight and power to translate, close quote. What did he give Joseph to translate? He gave him sight and power to translate. So the prophet translated as a seer through visual means. When it came to organizing the church, he didn't just sit down and figure out how it should be organized. He was shown the organization of the church in vision. If you read section 107, where it talks about the 70s, it says that it is according to the vision that the 70s should be organized. Then he goes on to explain the organization that he had seen in vision. Similarly, when the prophet finally rolled the keys of the kingdom off to the 12 in the spring of 1844, he did so with this comment, quote, I have now finished the work which was laid upon me by committing to you all things for the building up of the kingdom according to the heavenly vision and the pattern shown to me from heaven. Close quote. Much that we have didn't come just because Joseph Smith prayed and received a revelation. It came because of the principle of vision and revelation, opening to view the scenes of the last days and the scenes of the organization of the church and the scenes of doctrine to the prophet. And this was true of the temples. The prophet didn't just sit down and get himself an architect. He says, quote, "Lord, what do you want to build?" Close quote. And the Lord showed it to him. When it came to the Nauvoo temple, the temple was under construction, and the time that Josiah Quincy and his distinguished friend, Charles Francis Adams, visited Nauvoo just before the martyrdom, so the prophet took them around the city, and among other things, he took them to the temple site. As they were there, the workmen were working on the temple, and one of them was working on one of these huge face stones that sits up on the top of the pillars. If you have a vision on your mind to the Nauvoo temple. And this good brother asked the prophet, quote, "Brother Joseph, is this face exactly like the one that you saw in vision?" Close quote. The prophet sits back and looks at it and studies it over, and he says, quote, "Very near it, except the nose is just a thought too broad." Close quote. Then Josiah Quincy makes this comment, quote, "Being presumably like something Smith had seen in vision, it cannot be compared to any ecclesiastical building which may be discerned by the natural eyesight." Close quote. During the course of that building, the prophet did hire an architect to translate his vision to architectural design. This good brother by the name of Weeks came in one day and he said, quote, "Joseph, this thing just isn't conventional. It just defies everything in regard to architectural design. I suggest that you do this and this and this." Close quote. Well, the prophet listened to him very carefully, and when he got through, Joseph made this comment, quote, "I wish you to carry out my designs. I have seen in vision the splendid appearance of that building, illuminated, and will have it built according to the pattern shown to me." Close quote. When you enjoy the blessings of the gospel, my brothers and sisters, think where they came from. They came from a latter-day seer. They came from a man who could say and did say, quote, "Paul has seen the third heavens, and I more." Close quote. They came from a man who wrote to a prominent American and said, quote, "I have witnessed the vision of eternity and beheld the glorious mansions of bliss and the regions of the misery of the damned. I have heard the voice of God and communed with angels and spoke as moved upon by the Holy Ghost for the renewal of the everlasting covenant and for the gathering of Israel in the last days. It is my meditation all the day and more than my meat and drink to know how I shall make the saints of God comprehend the visions that rolled like an overflowing surge before my mind." Close quote. Then he gave that greatest of all recorded discourses, and I underscore the word recorded, the King Follett Address. He concluded with this statement, quote, "You don't know me. You never knew my heart. No man knows my history. I cannot tell it. I shall never undertake it. I don't blame anyone for not believing my history. If I had not experienced what I have, I could not believe it myself." Close quote. On that basis, then, as we talk about the prophet and evaluate him, let me just give you one or two statements here in conclusion. I'm going to put away most of the rest of my notes and come down to a comment or two that may be helpful in the conclusion here on my remarks. Here's Wilfred Woodruff, quote, "There is not so great a man as Joseph standing in this generation. The Gentiles look upon him, and he is like a bed of gold concealed from human view. They know not his principles, his spirits, his wisdom, his virtue, his philanthropy, nor his calling. His mind, like Enoch's, expand as eternity, and only God can comprehend his souls." Close quote. Then there is the New York Sun, a paper in that day, quote, "This Joseph Smith must be set down as an extraordinary character, a prophet hero, as Carlyle might call him. He is one of the greatest men of the age, and in the future will rank with those who will in one way or another have stamped his impression strongly upon society." Close quote. Then there is John Greenleaf Whittier, the poet, quote, "Once in the world's history we have had a Yankee prophet, and we have had him in Joe Smith. For good or for evil, he has left his track on the great pathway of life, or to use the words of Horney, knocked out for himself a window in the wall of the 19th century, whence his ruddy, bold, good-humored face will peer out upon the generations to come." Close quote. I've studied my whole life about the prophet Joseph, academically and by personal interest, and I can safely say that, quote, "if you were to search out and find one man, and one man only, where the appellation of prophet, seer, and revelator can appropriately be used, above all other individuals who have held the prophetic calling from Adam to the present, with the exception of Jesus alone, that one man would be Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. He was a greater lawgiver than as Moses. He was a great seer than was Samuel, and in modern times he had a more phenomenal rise from more humble circumstances than Abraham Lincoln. He knew more theology, hands down, than Jonathan Edwards, and he, and not Emerson, is our greatest and wisest American." Close quote. I bear you my testimony that he was everything that he claimed to be: a prophet of God, a revelator, a seer, and that the great vision that he was given, opening the Lord's purposes for the future, is still in process. In fact, the biggest part of it is still yet to be done. And there are things to transpire in the not very far distant future which will be the major events of the dispensation and will overshadow everything that has happened so far, with the exception of those great founding experiences that Joseph Smith had himself, the first vision, Moroni, and others. And you people are living on the threshold of that day and age. May the Lord bless you to catch the vision of the prophet's work and to do that which you have been foreordained and appointed to do to bring it about, is my humble prayer in the sacred name of Jesus Christ. Amen.